All right, thanks everyone. We'll start our next session. Uh, First, can everyone hear me online? All right, if I don't hear anything, I'll assume audio is working.
Yeah, fine.
Okay, great. Welcome to our next session. I am going to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Laura Mueller. Just some background of us. We both went to Southern Illinois University, Carbondale together, which at the time was actually known as the Pluralist Philosophy Department, with a longstanding commitment both to the history of philosophy and a more engaged pluralistic approach to what it means to be doing philosophy. We met when Laura gave me a microwave in my very empty graduate school house, and have been dialogue ever since on everything from Ernst Cassirer idealism and Dewey to extracurricular activities. So it's great to be here with her. And let me give you a little more of her broader background. She's currently an assistant professor of philosophy at West Texas A&M University. Her research includes philosophy of education, philosophy of culture, and philosophy as a way of life. Her research presents education as the process that both creates and sustains culture, as well as a process of self-cultivation, including moral cultivation. As such, she focuses on the relationship between pedagogy and personhood, and education, community, and cultural values. She explores various theories and practices that embrace education as a fundamentally transformative process as part of PWL. Trained in the history of philosophy, her interests largely geared towards modern philosophy and pragmatism. In addition, pedagogical interests, she focuses on the ways in which institutions such as neoliberal universities are obstacles to ethical development in PWL. As she contributed to collections such as Philosophy of Culture, Theory, Method, and Way of Life, which is in the Brill series co-edited by Mike Chase, Matthew Sharp, and myself. The cultural power of personal objects, traditional accounts and new perspectives, and the person at the crossroads, a philosophical approach. And as part of her research in PWL, she is a certified logic-based therapist and a consultation practitioner through the Logic-Based Therapy and Consultation Institute. She is also an editor with myself at IDOS, the Journal for Philosophy of Culture, which will be doing 2 issues on PWL, the first of which I think maybe next month will be coming out. And a fellow at the American Institute for Philosophical and Cultural Thought. And her presentation today is PWL in Education. So let's give her a round of applause, get started. And I will float down, I'll keep a stopwatch and just float it over to you. You'll be ready.
I'm prepared. Thank you. Okay, just a few preliminary remarks before I get into my presentation. First of all, I would love that microwave back because mine currently causes fires whenever I use it. But more importantly, it is such an honor to be here. Marta and Elder and Pedro, thank you for your work, not only on this conference, but the overall MPWL project. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. And thank you to everyone who is here, both in person and digitally. I'm just learning so much being among everyone. And it's such an amazing experience to be here with all of you and hear your work and talk to you and meet so many faces in person. So PWL in education is a very broad topic. And what I'm going to present today is not directly reflective of the exact structure of my chapter, especially because I've heard a lot of things today that are making me rethink what I might want to include just a little bit in my chapter. And fortunately, I think maybe fortunately, we're going to hear a lot of familiar names and ideas in what I'm talking about today. Because we've gotten a more in-depth history from previous presentations, especially Wednesday, today's Friday, right? Especially Wednesday and yesterday in our historical section. So because this topic is very broad, I'm going to be telling, I guess, a kind of story as a historical overview in broad strokes. And I do want to acknowledge that the story has a bit of a masculine structure, as in there are a lot of men in this story, and I'm well aware of that. But one of the reasons I'm taking this particular approach is because I'm looking at educational institutions which were shaped by many of the things that we've already discussed in this conference so far. And I do want to acknowledge, and I do have this in my chapter, that there were a lot of really cool things going on outside of institutions. We had the Society of Letters. We had the first English feminist and modern philosopher, Mary Estelle, who was doing absolutely wonderful things with PWL. In the American tradition, we had Jane Addams, we had Anna Julia Cooper, we had a lot of Black scholars and intellectuals and activists doing things. And so much of this amazing work was done outside of institutions because these were individuals that for a long part of history in the Western world were not allowed to participate in institutions. So I'm not purposely leaving people out of the story, but I am looking at a particular part of the story, which is about institutions and the relationship between institutions and professionalized philosophy. And I'm specifically looking at the mainstream themes for Euro-American practices that influence our professional practices today. Okay. Also, I did practice this for a time limit earlier, so I think even with these impromptu comments, I'll still be within the time. And the colleague that allowed me to read this to him said it made him feel better. So far, for 100% of the time, it has been well received. Let's keep it at 100%. All right, so now I will be done. In his 2021 monograph, Intercultural Modes of Philosophy, Volume 1, Principles of Philosophical Community, Eli Kramer laments that, quote, current academic philosophy departments are often miserably poor communities, for, as he writes, philosophy lost its heart as a way of life in the name of professionalism. Many, if not most of us, might agree. We are, as Byung-Chul Han writes, burned out. We multitask in an effort to please institutions, to remain employed, an effort which stems from an unrelenting demand to produce. This model, one for us of the neoliberal university in late-stage capitalism, seems antithetical to PWL, which emphasizes knowledge of how to be. Formalized education has separated discourse from the existential practice dimension of life. Knowledge is an object, transferred and consumed, no longer the knowledge of how to be, but instead a knowledge of what. This critique is not unique to Kramer or Hahn or Pierre Hadot or even other more contemporary scholars. We see this kind of critique in Greek philosophers and can trace it through others. Kant and his distinction between learning and doing philosophy, Nietzsche and Schopenhauer as educator on the future of educational institutions and Twilight of the Idols, Schopenhauer in On Philosophy at Universities, up through present-day criticisms and analyses. PWL, or at least PWL tendencies, have persisted both as models against which to critique current philosophy and as an antidote to the diagnosed problems of today. Throughout these critiques and comparisons, we see not only that the spiritual dimension of philosophy has been displaced, but we also find accomplices in the shift. Universities as sites of formalized education, professionalism over community, busyness rather than cosmic orientation. However, we also see what some might call the radical pedagogy of PWL offering a way forward. So my chapter will observe PWL and education in three frameworks: education in terms of institutions, education from the sage in terms of how to be, and current applications of PWL in education. As Matt Sharp insisted in his presentation for NPWL last summer, to understand ourselves as philosophers, we must first understand our context within the university, for, as he draws from Hadot to state, universities and professional philosophy have a reciprocal causality. Distinguishing between the institution and the sage is thus a distinction to serve as a periscopic tool to observe current education and make way to better understand recent attempts to reunite PWL and education. In discussing institutions and the sage, I present four extended moments for each: the ancients, medieval church fathers, 17th and 18th century neo-humanism, and the neoliberalism informed situation today. Each moment provides a snapshot of institutions and the philosophical sage and casts our own situation in sharp relief. rife with faculty burnout and general student disengagement, where the humanities as a whole are valued in terms of economic output. PWL, however, also provides a therapeutic along with its diagnosis. PWL applications in education today continue to provide hope from the fringes, using ancient tools for contemporary solutions to long-lasting problems. In discussing ancient philosophical schools, Hadot provides 3 points that remain relevant. 1, ancient philosophy was always practiced within a group and, quote, required a common effort, community of research, mutual assistance, and spiritual support, end quote. 2, ancient philosophers within these philosophical communities always held before them a, quote, concern for living in the service of the human community, end quote. And 3, eventually philosophy and the teaching of it became subservient to the government and employability demands. The third point is emphasized in Hadot's incisive statement on the opposition between ancient philosophical schools and the contemporary university. Open quote. There is a radical opposition between the ancient philosophical school, which addressed individuals in order to transform their entire personality, and the university, whose mission is to give out diplomas which correspond to a certain level of objectifiable knowledge, close quote. And, there's a block quote, furthermore, the university tends to make the philosophy professor a civil servant, whose job, to a large extent, consists in training other civil servants. The goal is no longer, as it was in antiquity, to train people for careers as human beings, but to train them for careers as clerks or professors. That is to say, as specialists, theoreticians, and retainers of specific items or of more or less esoteric knowledge. Such knowledge, however, no longer involves the whole of life as ancient philosophy demanded, end quote. We can look at 4 key aspects of ancient communities providing an initial model of lived philosophy: cosmically informed citizenship, a disruption of habits, shared commitment to personal and social transformation, and a topical atypicality. The practice of spiritual exercises to cultivate such a cosmic awareness within a habit-disrupting community was necessary to self-mastery and social change. Philosophers shared a commitment to having an effect on a city or state, king or emperor, or what Eli calls a shared commitment to bringing the beloved community into actuality. As John Lynch points out, Plato's Academy, for instance, aimed at individual development and producing men who would be of use in running the state. The schools, with their unusual life choices and behaviors, were simultaneously metaphorically atopos and physically topical. They, quote, illuminate other possible ways of living in the world, and were thus, as Demansky says, ridiculous or at least bizarre in the eyes of the crowd. As engaged citizens whose communal lives were regulated by the ideal city, these schools challenged the typical material conditions of education. For instance, many such schools were free, financially and in terms of relationships between adherents. Philosophers were distinguished from sophists in part by their refusal to charge fees for their teachings. Epicureans and Stoics admitted everyone regardless of social status or gender. The Academy and the Lyceum were open to all, though they did need the means to support themselves. Members of Plato's Academy, quote, lived as a community of free, equal people insofar as their aspiration towards virtue equaled their desire to pursue shared research, quote. Free education supported by equality of scholar citizenship was, if not geographically atopos, so socially a topic within society. Within these communities, we find guidance by the ideal figure of the sage, often a regulative ethical ideal, as Kramer points out. An exemplar of lived wisdom, peace of mind, inner freedom, and cosmic consciousness, the sage was a figure identical with himself, and so found happiness within himself unperturbed by external events. Accompanying such happiness was autarkeia, for the sage was independent of external things. Conscious of being part of the world and plunged into the totality of the cosmos, the sage had a transformed perception of the world, with a unique temporal temperament, living and loving each moment as if it were the last, and perceiving each moment, quote, as if it were the first, all in the stupefying strangeness of its emergence, quote. In the cosmic perspective, the transformation of the self is not merely a shift in personal opinion, it is an understanding of the cosmos, a commitment to the truth of the world, as Sellers points out. We can think here of the Stoic sage who exercised the three disciplines, assent, judgment, and desire. The Stoic sage knew what he could and could not control, loved his fate, amor fati, and remembered his death, memento mori. He said yes to every moment. He recognized that that which is independent of us is indifferent, and so was indifferent to indifferent things, achieving an equanimity of the soul. While many of these schools were financially independent, financially dependent communities such as the Alexandrite Neoplatonists were vulnerable to social and religious trends such as Christianity. Christianity's eventual dominance shifted philosophy from a practice and service to community through personal and political change to a handmaiden of theology in medieval universities, providing the theoretical apparatus for the Christian spiritual life. The church fathers severed the life of the pagan philosophical sage from philosophical discourse. Ancient sages revealed certain moral rules helpful to the Christian life, but sages were incapable of fully living and practicing such virtues, a feat only possible through the grace of God. Thus, Christian monasticism, which, like ancient philosophy, harbored a life of virtue, lived in accord with wisdom and spiritual transformation, detached the very life and personality of the philosopher from the discourse informed and shaped by that life. This severance altered conceptions of philosophy, for in the ancient world, the life of the philosopher was the fulfillment of philosophy, as Demansky points out. This life lost its lauded place, instead becoming secondary to what philosophical theory could do for Christian ways of life. We may see many of our own educational issues, which include approaching philosophy only as a skill set that supplements other knowledges, as similar to this early cleavage of life from thought. This overweening emphasis on theory carried into the 18th century, accompanied by state interests as well. This philosophical moment is particularly noticeable by way of critiques of university philosophy by both those within and outside of the university system. Kant's conflict of the faculties, for example, argued for philosophy's new autonomy within a university system whose purpose was primarily to create doctors. Sharp concludes that, quote, pedagogy is supported to the transpersonal goal of systematic, pure, or absolute knowledge as an end in itself. Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, however, bemoan the subordination of philosophy to another master, the state. Schopenhauer, in a delightfully spiteful essay on philosophy at the universities, eviscerates professional philosophy's subordination to the state and religion. Truth, he dictates, has a secondary place to establish religious claims within university philosophy, religious claims which were held up by the state. Nietzsche echoes these claims in On the Future of Educational Institutions. Here, the philosopher's student bemoans two seemingly antagonistic tendencies equally deleterious in their action: the expansion of education to the masses and the minimization of education. The latter subordinates education to service to the state. This complaint is iterated in his 1873 Schopenhauer as Educator, and even later in Twilight of the Idols. Schopenhauer finds professors blameworthy for, quote, their real concern is to earn with credit an honest livelihood for themselves, and moreover to enjoy a certain prestige in the eyes of the public, end quote. He says that university philosophers are not real philosophers, but mere sophists concerned with upholding the church and state truths to earn money, a major contrast between university philosophy, even as we know it today, and financially free ancient schools. Nietzsche and Schopenhauer also lament the loss of an ethical exemplarity from mediocre professors are what professional philosophy offers. While the church fathers at least recognized virtuous practices and philosophical personalities, and the abbot was a symbol of ethical exemplarity, by the time of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, mediocre professors replaced the stage. For both, university professors are motivated by the demand for currency. Nietzsche complains that higher schools are, quote, geared toward the most questionable mediocrity in their teachers, in their teaching plans, in their teaching goals, end quote, and says that teachers are overloaded and stupefied and everything is done with haste. University philosophers, he says, no longer know how to see. Such blindness was not unique to 19th century teachers, and it is not unique to us. It is, as Hadot pointed out, a symptom of the human condition, one which the ancient philosophers sought to cure. Even in antiquity, as Hadot says, quote, people were not conscious of living in the world. They had no time to look at the world, and philosophers strongly sensed the paradox and scandal of the human condition. Man lives in the world without perceiving the world, end quote. We can only perceive the world beyond its utilitarian means when we learn to see. Quote, to put off judgment, to learn to walk around all sides of the individual case and comprehend it from all sides. Not to react to a stimulus right away, but to keep in check the instinct to restrict and exclude, end quote. And yet today we have no space for seeing, no space for the vita contemplativa, as Hahn puts it. We are achievement subjects with a fragmented and shattered perception, a mounting burden of work, and an ensuing particular disposition toward time and attention. Between time, a time of boredom between one task and another is lost. Achievement subjects move from one clump of tasks to another, tragically multitasking, leaving no room for the deep boredom needed for contemplation. This is the world of the philosopher professor, that university philosopher who lives according to an endless series of grading, course prep, writing deadlines, committee work, word limits, conferences, and publishing goals. Contemplation is now a career, and career contemplation lacks the cosmic touch. As Hahn states, we achievement subjects are performance machines seeking excellence in terms of measurable outcomes. As entrepreneurs of the self, we say, yes, we can to projects all in the name of a telos of excellence that is never achieved or even defined. We are depressed, fragmented, burned out, and rather than achieving sagacity, become filled with encouraged vices. The commodification of knowledge, whether it's training workers or the direct market value of our research, seems to render nugatory the invitation to each human being to transform himself. In our current life, governed by late-stage capitalism and neoliberalism, our academia is one of academic capitalism, where profitability in terms of knowledge and knowledge production reigns supreme. Any knowledge sought in universities is usually a capital for return on investment rather than a lived wisdom. The knowledge of how to be is knowledge of how to be a consumer and producer rather than a quest for wisdom. As Brandon Absher writes, quote, at the end of the day, the neoliberal university favors and seeks to produce knowledge that is directly profitable to corporate partners and donors while disfavoring work that serves broader public aims or which has no utility outside itself, end quote. This commodification of knowledge prioritizes training rather than education, altering the university from an institution that educates for moral growth, self-governance, autonomy, and citizenship to one that trains a workforce for corporations. Professionalized philosophy, often a construction of technical jargon reserved for specialists, as Hadot says, and isolation and fragmentation have led to these miserably poor communities that Kramer heartbrokenly laments. Morosity need not overtake our fragmented, achieving, isolated selves. We must keep clear before the mind's eye, philosophy, especially PWL, existed in the margins of society, and as such was a diagnosis and therapeutic in each extended moment discussed. The problems we face are particular manifestations of the more generic human condition, shaped but not caused by late-stage capitalism, and significant attempts to revive PWL in education provide a path forward. Among the myriad of ongoing PWL projects, we can pull a few institutional and pedagogical practices to showcase the application of PWL. In the interest of time, I will focus my discussion on pedagogical practices for those of us dwelling in traditional institutions. We should recognize, however, that there are educational communities simultaneously topical and atopos, living commitments to the beloved community, luring images, as Eli would say, of how things could be, focusing on inner and outer transformation through civic engagement and community living. A few examples are Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies, Deep Springs College in California, the International School of Philosophy in the Netherlands, the Munich University of Philosophy, the University for Humanistic Studies, and the Dharma Realm Buddhist University in California, and this is to name but a few. Many of us find ourselves in traditional institutions in which several aspects are outside the realm of our control, and so we find our freedom in the classroom. PWL scholars intersect with philosophers of education in applying self-transformation to pedagogy, creating meaning, not just utility, in our careers. Sages we may not be, but we do transmit cultural values and ideas of what philosophy is or should be to our students. Content and practices implicitly tell our students how philosophy is done, what counts as philosophy, and who a philosopher must be. Is philosophy a seemingly random smattering of somewhat related texts? Is it a practice of writing solid argumentative papers? Is it a set of skills that they can use to improve their resumes? If we take philosophy as a practice of living and acting well, of beginning in an existential choice, then we must task ourselves with showing those commitments to our students in what and how we teach them. Jake Wright of the University of Minnesota argues that PWL pedagogy is, quote, paradoxically radical. On the one hand, it presses traditional boundaries. On the other, it gets to the root of teaching, end quote. Viewed this way, we might say that PWL is both the center insofar as it is the root or origin of teaching, and at the circumference insofar as it is no longer commonplace in the classroom. PWL pedagogy is transformatively radical, says Wright, insofar as it seeks to transform students and society rather than offering only vocational training. He says it is also technically radical as it endeavors to fundamentally change institutions, culture, and what we consider to be effective teaching. Radical PWL seems perhaps the most traditional approach insofar as it does get back to the root. PWL-focused syllabi, for instance, are less interested in providing a smorgasbord of information than they are in contributing to our understanding of the good life. Activities radical for us, but not perhaps for our predecessors, appear. Wright, for instance, includes a signature ethics as a way of life class activity, providing a menu of around 10 activities for students to choose to engage in, from attending religious services to participating in local government. Monica Jansen, Benjamin Hull, and Ramona Aaliyah structure an ethics course around cosmic consciousness through engaged citizenship. Their civic engagement project involves email and calling local representatives, writing change-making letters, developing virtues and changing habits, and volunteering, charitable giving, and organizing an activity to make a positive change. Through civic engagement, students develop agency along with the cosmic consciousness that allows them to see their situatedness in the world. Students, quote, move from anguish toward an understanding that their actions do impact the world, such that they experience an inner peace that can free them from the anguish they feel. Seemingly inspired by the Socratic goal to make city life valuable for moral development and to inject intellectual concern into daily existence, these so-called radical techniques seem steeped in tradition. PWL pedagogy goes beyond particular kinds of assignments. Mueller and Kramer, inspired by Leonard Nelson's Socratic dialogue, offer modern Socratic dialogue, or MSD, as a pedagogical technique to develop parrhesia in the classroom. Offering core tenets of MSD, from lived examples to shared exemplars, Mueller and Kramer show that the practice, quote, involves not only honesty with others, but honesty with oneself as a mutually reinforced exercise of transformation. Again, drawing directly from ancients, this time the Epicureans, we see a return to the center now practiced from the fringes. Some of my own students have stated that the most transformative activity they experienced in class was reading Spinoza's Ethics, a most traditional endeavor indeed. We can also turn to Matthew Sharp's capstone unit for advanced students, many of whom continue on to become professional philosophers. Knowing full well the burnout and vices his students will face, Sharp shows his students how to be professional philosophers by reflecting critically on what it is to be an academic philosopher today. Sharp provides his honors class, Philosophy, Sophistry, and Epistemic Vices, as an example, using Plato's Republic to see the philosopher situated within the city, selections from Bacon's Novum Organum 1 to demonstrate philosophers' internal, all too human tendencies to epistemic biases and errors, and Cavisto's Vices of Learning to examine academics in the early modern university. Sharp provides a vision of philosophy in its totality for potential professional philosophers. And these are just a few among many other examples, and I am planning on looking at Stephen's website for his class that he mentioned just a little bit ago. Historical moments in PWL, ancient communities, Enlightenment era humanism, the life of medieval church fathers, and 19th century critiques illuminate our own situation in various ways. We see firstly that while our situation may seem so uniquely dire, a consequence of neoliberalism, and thus neoliberalism is easily blamable for all our woes, philosophy's subservience in academic institutions began over a millennia before our current crisis. And we have seen in this conference that perhaps that is not the whole story. Even Socrates complained about institutionalized education and his students. We are not alone. While neoliberalism shapes certain problems we face, it is not the sole cause of them. Rather, philosophers throughout time have faced and have strived to overcome such crises. PWL practices, both ancient and modern, are vital in facing our contemporary educational shortcomings. It provides diagnostic tools, a hopeful prognosis, and therapeutic prescriptions for meaningful education, where knowledge is also knowledge of how to be wise, or at least how to step onto the path. And it is not, as Hadot tells us, an easy matter.
Exactly on time. With that said, are there questions? I'm also gonna prioritize, we've been bad about asking the questions from the chat. So if there are people online who have questions, I'll try to prioritize you as you come up. Whoop,
Okay.
they got, you were just beaten by, half a second here, all right. I'm gonna read this out, apologies if I repeat it.
Please turn on your mic.
Oh, yeah, thank you. All right, let's go ahead. Sorry for that, for turning off the mic. I'm gonna read the question online. Let's do this. So I'm a person from the civilian community. We're in Portugal, is welcome to participate at the symposium at no cost. We're so lucky. I've learned immensely through all the talks, even only understanding a small fraction of them. Yet you do not talk about us, the people living outside the university realm who are curious to live by the philosophy for good living. Please continue studying for us also. We, the common people, need desperately your guidance. The world is lost and needs your thinking. Laura is trying, comes to the common people classroom. She also gave an email. But maybe it would also be worth just, hinting at PWL spaces beyond, education in, like, what are models of that you might look at? Maybe.
Well, I know, for example, the Institute in the Netherlands is a non-traditional institution. Funding is a big part of it. I think their funding actually comes from their public house and they host conferences. And I think they have a hotel attached, right? Also so they have a funding system, this funding from their publishing and their conference hosting and from the hotels actually allows them to offer classes for community members, shaped by community members' interests. So they have a whole host of different kinds of people that are coming to their institute, because that's the point of it, is to be a community center. I know, well, I read your interview with some of the people there, and they offer classes for firefighters, classes for emergency responders, seminars with and for police officers, teachers, nurses, and so on and so forth. I think, a big issue is this economic interest, right? We cannot overlook the economic interest, and so much is confined to universities because this is what is funding us. I know there are people like Eli, his lifelong project is to actually build a kind of community philosophy center. I want to say, trying to think of some others off the cuff.
Marta, what's the one that here you do courses with sometimes? There's actually one in Portugal that does classes.
It's a part of the university. It's a private center that offers courses for the non-specialized audiences.
It's a lifelong research center.
So yeah, for those interested, there is one in Portugal as well, for those around. Let's go to others. I also see there was a question here. Later, maybe you can relist some of the other places you mentioned, because the people online were interested in getting that repeated. But let's go, John, and then, and showing the back. We'll go 1, 2, then 3. Okay, I have it.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So, well, first of all, Laura, thank you, brilliant presentation and very nicely done. Quick comment on that about philosophy as a way of life for a public audience, for people who are tuning in. I have to give a plug to modernstoicism.com. Stoic Week will be starting in about 10 days' time. This is free, online, open to all. You can sign up and learn how to live like a Stoic philosopher for a week as an experiment to see how that goes for you. So I would encourage people to look at that. And as I say, that's free, open to all. That's basically run by a group of volunteers, and we get a few Patreon donations that help pay for the website. But basically, it's all done on a volunteer basis.
I think there's an app too.
There is, yeah.
The Daily Stoic, is it called? Is that their app, or is that something else?
That's something different. Let's not go there.
Okay. I clearly don't have that app.
Quick comment on Laura's paper though. So thinking about the trials and tribulations of contemporary academia. Let's take you talked a bit about the kind of the historical background to that. And just thinking about, okay, let's take the view from above about our current traumas and dilemmas and try and put them into a wider context. Particular text that I fell in love with not long ago is a short text by the unsurprisingly Renaissance humanist Leon Battista Alberti on the uses and disadvantages of letters, in which he describes he describes all of the problems facing 21st century academics in the 1440s, right? He talks about precarious job contracts. He talks about ambition and promotion amongst academics. He talks about student debt. He talks about the lack of career prospects. Every single thing that all of us in this room will gripe about, he's describing in the 1440s. He even talks about the fact that there's too much to read and it's impossible to keep on top of the literature. And this is before the invention of printing, right? There was too much to read even in the manuscript era. And so I think that's very healthy for us, right? When we're facing these difficulties, to realise that it's always been like that, and that in itself can be a therapeutic reflection.
Just to give this organization and you, John, a plug. John did a presentation on Alberti for the MPWL monthly meeting, and I'm pretty sure those were all recorded and put online, if anyone wants to see it too.
And Katerina said she already signed up for Stoic Week, so success. There's another question online, but I do want to get, so just make sure to get your question out quickly so that then we can get to the other online questions, so.
So who's next? Martin?
No, first over here, then over there.
Sure.
You still have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Laura, I wanted to ask about, one thing that there was in the medieval context is you've got these, reforming, opportunities, both, it's very often the Benedictines will reform, or you get new orders and new institutions, and you also have, masters competing for students. And I wonder, there is kind of a contemporary equivalent in that there's at least the possibility now of there are philosophy YouTube channels, and there are people who are sort of recruiting students through there. Do you think there are any possibilities there? And then, or are maybe the institutional pressures too great? Because one thing that's difficult in our context is just what the startup costs and the issues of accreditation if you want an informal education. But on the other hand, the costs of starting a YouTube channel or recruiting people and students and sharing what you think online are very low. So how do you sort of see that dynamic?
Are you asking, do I think we have the possibilities to do those things?
Yeah, whether the non-traditional whether technologies that enable non-traditional forms of learning might provide an effective alternative, even though institutionally it's very hard to set up new accredited higher education institutions.
It depends on what you mean by effective. So what do you mean by effective?
Well, institutions that could help people live philosophically.
Okay, just checking, thank you. I think that I really like that this information is more and more available to people. Of course, an issue with that is you will get apps apparently like the Daily Stoic, right? Where we get information that maybe is just misleading. I think it would be great if more academics were looking at how to reach, as Katerina said, the civilians, right? The people outside of the university. I'm also very tired in every day of my life, right? Like it's really, really hard to have the time and the energy and the startup costs to do that. And I think what your question really is getting at is there are problems with our institutional structures that might often prohibit us from doing those kinds of things. Does that somewhat answer your question? Yeah. I also want to say, I find in an odd kind of twist that sometimes I feel like I'm in my classes, even to get enrollment, I'm competing with these YouTube channels. If students I teach a lot of gen eds or core courses, so the students have to take that, but they can choose from a variety of core classes. So I feel like there's this attitude of, why should I pay to take this class when I can take something more related to my degree? And if I want to learn about philosophy, I can just get on TikTok or YouTube. And I find that a very interesting twist because I don't think we're doing something that you can just learn from watching YouTube videos about text. I think for me, one of the most exciting and meaningful parts of PWL is the situatedness within a community, having constant frank speech and spiritual support and doing the habit disrupting work that you just don't get when you're watching a YouTube, right? I would like to say, look, you can learn how to use Excel for accounting by watching a YouTube video, but you cannot learn how to do dialogue and get the psychagogic effects of dialogue just from these apps. For that, you need a community of people in person or at least face to face somehow talking to one another.
And with that, I know I promised that we would have people after Caleb, but we've totally ran out of time. And in the spirit of our good organizers here of staying on schedule, I'll take my role here seriously. So let's give another round of applause. Silvio, who had a question online, you actually ended up partially answering it, but if you want contact information for Dr. Mueller, you can let us know, we can put you in contact.
You can just Google me.
Yeah, you can Google you and we're happy to do follow-up.
There is another Laura Joy Mueller though, so if you Google me to contact me, make sure it's me at Texas. There's another one out there.